Okay, so now we've created the flowcharts to give us an idea of uh, how we want our project to work. So now let's go ahead and implement uh, the methods that we came up with. I'm going to go ahead and pin my Visual Studio to the taskbar because we'll be using it a lot. And I'll go ahead and create a new project. I'll change the name to something meaningful so I can easily recognize it. I want to do a Windows Form application. This is going to be a wage calculator from a gross pay. So I'll call it something along those lines. Calculate gross pay. And I'm, again, not going to add it to any source control. So I will go ahead and click OK. Now, as we've seen previously, I can adjust the size of the form. So we know that we're going to want to get the number of hours that the person worked and also their hourly wage. Let's go ahead and we're going to open up the toolbox here, which we will pin so that it stays there. And feel free to adjust the Solution Explorer and the different items as you see fit. So the first thing we'll do is we'll change the form name. To, again, something meaningful. We're continuing to use the camelback notation. That's camelback notation, lowercase letter for the first word and subsequently uppercase for each following word. Again, easier to follow what the word is. We'll go ahead and refactor these. Refactor just means to update the code in some way to clean it up, and we're going to refactor the name here and also change it to form calculate pay. All right. So we can go ahead and change the text of the text property, and forms are objects. We'll learn more about objects as we go, but effectively it's a group of information that relates to the same thing. In this case, all these properties relate to this particular form. So let's go ahead and change the text there. Now we want to go ahead and start to add some of the controls we're going to use. And one of the things you want to notice when you place controls is that you'll get some alignment bars, alignment indicators, which will help you line things up. And the truth is that forms that are lined up are actually easier for your user to understand. There's a whole field of HCI related, human-computer interaction, related to designing things in such a way that they're easier and more efficient for users. So we're going to need a couple of text boxes and a couple of labels. So we have labels and text boxes. Now labels generally display text, but that's all they do. You can programmatically you can change the text they display. You can change all the properties on them, set them up the way you want. But in general, what they're going to do is display text. Text boxes, on the other hand, are designed to allow the user to input information. So if we look at thinking back to the flow charts, we had the input, output, and the text box would be a way to get input from the user. So now you can see these buttons. Nice thing to do is again to make the form consistent. easier for the user to use. So we'll go ahead and use the Make Same Size button. You can see, voila, all the buttons the same size. Now we can go ahead and start renaming some of these controls. We'll change the name of this control to something meaningful. This is going to be the hours that the person worked. And again, this is a very simple form, but it's just to get you an idea of how to start setting these things up. Now, the text, again, we want it to indicate to the user what exactly they'll be putting in that text box that's next to us. So hours worked. Now we will continue on, and we'll change that label. And again, this is merely for display purposes. It really doesn't affect your program particularly very much. It's just to allow the GUI to reflect what particular things are on it to help the user understand the purpose of some of this stuff. So hourly pay rate, we'll change the label. And I'll say this, like you can see I'm using LBL for the beginning to indicate label. And as far as that goes, it doesn't matter if you say label or button or FRM for form, but what you should do, if you want to say button calculate pay instead of saying BTN, button's fine, but what you should do is be consistent throughout. So if you use button as the first part of a variable that's a button, that's great, but do it for all your buttons. If you use the abbreviation LBL for labels, label hours worked, use LBL for all the labels. You should try to be consistent. It will really help people follow your code and help you follow what you're doing. So, like I said, try to be consistent with your naming standards. Some organizations will actually have official naming, variable naming standards, and you'll have to follow them. So I will change this to calculate gross pay, and let's try this out. And you can see it doesn't fit. So I'm going to mess around with the size here to see if I can get it to fit. Let me open this up a little bit. Move some of these over. Increase the width here. There we go. Of course, now they're not the same size, but don't forget the trick. I can go ahead and select all three of these, and then if I hit make same size, it'll match the first one I selected. You can select multiple things using the control key, so I can click on it with the control key down and click on another one. Now I'm going to go ahead and use the same spacing between them. You notice the button 2 and button 3 are different spacing. I'm going to hit this make horizontal spacing equal, and now there's consistent spacing between the buttons, which is again easier for the user to recognize and makes it look a little neater. So, and again, notice that there are those alignment indicators, those little blue lines showing up to help me get everything to be aligned and straight. So definitely use that to your advantage. Okay, let me go ahead and change these names. Again, I used button for the last button, so I should be consistent with that, and use button again. But again, I'm going to add something to make it meaningful, so button clear. Then, of course, I'm going to find the text property and update it to be clear. And then I'll go to the text property for the exit button. I'll change it to exit. And then I will go up and change the actual text that's on it, actual name to button exit, excuse me. So now I have the basic controls I want. So now I can go ahead and implement some of this. Remember, if you double click on one of these buttons, it will go ahead and generate an event handler. We mentioned event handlers for Hello World briefly, and we'll talk more about them. So if I double click on this exit button, it will generate for me an event handler. And this is the code that gets called if the operating system generates an event that someone clicked on this specific button. So this is the exit button. So what I want to do here is simply shut down the Windows form. Now, if you don't know how to do that, if you're not sure, what should you do? Well, I recommend pull out Google, pull out your browser, do a search, figure it out. Now, some of these things you'll start to know how to do, but you can simply look up either on Microsoft site or some of the other sites. You can look up reference material. That's great. And so we'll go ahead and it's System Windows Forms Application Exit. So if you recall our flowchart, pretty much the flowchart just had the one thing in it that would exit. Now, I could go ahead and start to build other of my methods, but I recommend you don't do that. We have created a method. Let's go ahead and test it right away. That way you can ensure that that piece of code is working and you won't end up with a bunch of errors all at once. So let's go ahead and click exit. Looks like it exits. That's pretty good. That's not, for now our tests will be pretty simple, like does it do what we expect? And when you're testing, you should always think ahead of time, what do I expect? How do you know if you got what you expected if you didn't even think about it ahead of time? All right, so now the button clear, we'll use the this keyword for this. This indicates relating to this form. And now if we look, there's Textbox 1. What is Textbox 1? Do you remember? Because I don't. I don't know which one is Textbox 1. So it turns out that there's a reason I like to use naming conventions. I see Textbox 1, I don't know what it means, right? But I know this text box is actually supposed to be the hours worked. So why don't I go ahead and change the text box to text box, text box hours or something along those lines. I seem to have lost my Visual Studio for the moment. You see here, I'll jump back in. There we go. So I'll go ahead and rename the text box. And one of the reasons that you want to do this is that the IntelliSense that Visual Studio has, which is that autocomplete that it does for you and auto search that it will do. If you name them something meaningful when those things come up, you can go like, oh, okay, I want to clear the text on the text box for hours, right? So also you can see that if I use a consistent naming convention, like all my text boxes start with text box, it's easier for me to use the IntelliSense. So that's another good reason to use consistent naming. Okay, you see here I'm trying to assign this with an empty string. Okay, but it's important to remember that text box hours is not a string. It is a text box. It does in fact have a property that is for text, and we can use the dot operator and it will show us the properties that we can set, and we want to set the text to nothing. That's very simple. All right, we'll do the same thing. It turns out we could either use the this keyword or not. I like to use it, but it's not required. And again, we'll do text box pay rate equals the empty string, which is, quote, quote next to each other, which will, as we'll see. So the next thing we should do, should we go on and write another method? Good. I'm glad you said no. No, you should not write a method. You should test the one you just wrote. So let's go ahead and we'll put in some text. Now it turns out we aren't doing any error checking. We're just taking whatever text they give us, which is fine for now. And we hit the clear button, and it does in fact wipe it out. Great. Double check it. Okay, now we'll hit exit. Looks like that still works too. All right, so we've made two of our methods, and now we just have left the calculate gross pay, which is the most complex of the methods. So now for the first time, we're going to have to actually declare a variable because now, as remember our flow chart, we actually had information we had to store, right? We had to get the gross pay and store it someplace. Now what we want to do is we want to have the text is the pay rate, and also we want to look at what the hours are. But we're going to declare, as you remember from your flow chart, you have to declare a variable before you use it. So we're going to declare gross pay. We'll declare it a double, which is a floating point number, which we'll talk more about later. But effectively, it's something that has decimals in it, not like an integer. It's actually much more complex than that, but we don't have to know that for now. So then what we want to do is take the two numbers and multiply them together, and I'm adding them. But anyway, we'll get back to that. We'll do the text box hours times the but what's wrong here? I mean, can we do this? What kind of information is the text? Is it a number? Well, no, it's a string. And we know that type matters. And you can see the error tells us you cannot apply the multiplication symbol to these two texts. What we need to do is find out a way to convert these over to a number. So it turns out that in the library there's a method that does this for you called convert. And we hit the dot operator, it'll bring up the other methods within this class. Convert is actually a class, and we're going to use the two-double method. We could use two decimal if we wanted gross pay to be a decimal. We've already declared gross pay a double, so let's be consistent. Otherwise, we could run into some problems. So we're going to convert to double, and we're going to give it the string that's in the text box text, in the text box text property. And we'll do the same thing for the hours. So this will go ahead and convert these numbers from text to numbers. Now we could manually do this ourselves, but there's already a method that does it for it. So let's go ahead and use it. But again, the key there is that types matter in this language. We have to be concerned with what type something is, and we can't simply go back and forth all the time between different types. We have to specifically declare how to do that. In this case, we're going from text to doubles. We convert the two over to doubles, and then we multiply them together, and that gives us gross pay. Okay, well now we have another problem though, right? Because we haven't actually created a space to display gross pay. So let's go ahead and add a label and a text box for the gross pay. Technically, I should use a label to display the text as well. And I'll let you think about why I should use a label instead of a text box to display the information about the gross pay. So I'll give you a couple seconds to think about that while I'm renaming this and changing the text, right? This is going to be gross pay. All right, there we go. Okay, so now we have gross pay. We need a text box. That's what we'll display the calculated gross pay in, which again, now thinking about this, is the user actually going to put in the gross pay? And the answer is no. And that's why I should probably use a label. I could actually change the properties on the text box to prevent them from updating it, which really is sort of like a label anyway, so I could do that too. But if you think about that, when you're going to calculate something and display it back to the user, if it's not something they're giving you, it'd be better to put a label up there and not give them the option to overwrite what you calculate for them. Okay, so now I have my gross pay text box and gross pay label, and I can come back here, and now I have gross pay. And what kind of data is gross pay? What did I declare it as? It always, throughout the life of this method, gross pay will always be a double. So, what kind of information do I want to put out on the form? Am I putting a double out there? And again, notice that by using consistent naming, I can find my text box gross pay very easily because I know it's going to be a text box, and I can just start with TEXT. But it's the text I want to update, right? Text is what kind of data? Text is a string. So if it turns out, if I look at this, it won't let me do that. Cannot implicitly convert a double to a string. So it turns out that almost every object out there will have a toString method, which what this will do is just take the numeric information and convert it. Now it's a method, so it always ends with parentheses. So this should, if I press the calculate button, go ahead and take the information that's in gross pay and store it in the text box. I mean, it should calculate gross pay, and then when I hit that calculate pay button, it should store it. So let's go ahead. We'll give it a couple numbers. And it's good to choose simple numbers when you first do this, because if you choose simple numbers, it'll be very easy for you to tell, is it working the way you expect. That doesn't mean that's the only test you want to do, but at the beginning, 2 times 3, I remember what it is. Well, look at that. I hit clear and what didn't happen? Another reason to test is, what did I forget to do? In clear, I should probably also update the gross pay text box. It would be actually pretty similar if I had chosen a label. I would again update the text and go ahead and give it the empty string. All right, so that looks like I'm in pretty good shape. Let me see if it worked. Okay, so I'll put in a couple numbers. Again, I'm choosing numbers that are easy for me to know. So I should be able to, in my head, know it's 340. Clear it. It clears them all. Okay, so I've successfully created a very simple wage calculator that uses multiplication. It uses convert to go back and forth from text to a different type. And it uses the toString method to convert a double back into a string so I can display it. So what's important to recognize is, in your naming conventions, be consistent, and test as you go. Don't write all your code and then try to make sure it works. All right, so I'll see you guys on Monday, and we'll try some of this in class.